We are live. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to the fifth live talk by the Oxford University Italian Society. Our student association tries to favor the exchange of ideas between students, professors, researchers, and influential Italian guests. Today, we have the privilege to host the OECD economist Andrea Garnero. Good morning, Dr. Garnero.
Hello, hi everyone.
Andrea Garnero is an economist and expert in labor market at the OECD, which is an international organization for economic cooperation and development. Between 2013 and 2014, Andrea Garnero was an assistant for economic affairs and G20 assistant Sherpa to the Italian Prime Minister Enrico Letta. Moreover, he was an economist at the European Commission between 2011 and 2014. This morning, Dr. Garnero will deliver a speech on the OECD brief regarding the options for an immediate employment and social policy response in the post-COVID scenario. After that, we will have 10 to 15 minutes of questions by me and the committee. And finally, we will have questions from our audience. So please feel free to leave your questions below, and I will be very happy to read them out. Until then, Dr. Garnero, please, the stage is yours. You may begin.
Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot for the invite. I've prepared a few slides to share with you, mainly to show a few striking charts maybe from this crisis. What I'm gonna present you today, it's let's say a preview, a first tentative assessment of the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on OECD markets, and so how an health crisis turned into a job crisis 2 months. And I'll give you a bit the first assessment we are giving at the OECD and the policies that countries have put in place in the recent months and what we see as the outlook ahead. So OECD countries have put in place a very different and number of containment strategies since the outbreak of the coronavirus in China in late December. Almost 90% of OECD countries put a series of restrictions to individual mobility and economic activities that varied a lot and ranged across some countries like Italy, for instance. Restrictions were extremely tough, precise, and very strict. And so, as you well know, individual mobility was extremely restricted, and economic activities was for a couple of months restricted to the so-called essential services, so services that could not be stopped in order to ensure the continuity of services and delivery of food. And restrictions were very limited or almost absent. Maybe the main example in this case is Sweden, Europe, where restrictions to individual mobility and economic activities were very limited. With these restrictions in place, but even with the simple awareness of the gravity and importance and the danger of the virus, mobility started falling across the board. So here you see mobility trends measured by Google using location on smartphones, and you see that as of the early March, mobility started to fall across the board in all OECD countries. This is an average for 3 groups: countries that had no or limited restrictions, such as Sweden; countries that had local or group-specific restrictions, such as, for instance, Germany; and countries where there were nationwide lockdowns, like Italy or Spain. And you see that mobility fell in all on average, fell across the board in all countries. So I think this is the first conclusion that we can, first tentative conclusion, of course, that we can derive at the moment, is that maybe the mandatory measures taken by countries matter less than what we think. There is some evidence by colleagues at the IMF, the World Bank, and also something that we have done more, let's say, robust analysis that we did with US data that shows that the economic impact has been less linked to the mandatory measures and more to the fall in mobility, and therefore to, we assume, to the spread virus and risks that people incurred if they kept working or going around. There is a nice paper by few Danish economists that shows that between Denmark and Sweden, which adopted different strategies, the fall in consumption using credit card data has been fairly similar across the two countries. So consumption fell in Sweden, even though the lockdown was there was no lockdown, and the mandatory measures were practically absent and restricted to few groups in danger. So I think that's the first takeaway, tentative takeaway, let's put it that way, that we can bring home in this first phase of the crisis and the early evidence that we have for the time being. So how bad is it for the labor market? So you have all seen this eye-watering chart for the United States. Every week now, since more than 2 months, we have been used to see that millions of workers have claimed for an unemployment insurance benefit in the United States. We are now, yesterday, on Thursday, the latest were 40 million workers claimed an insurance benefit in the United States. This means 1 in 4 US workers. So that's a major, massive shock for the US economy. Thing never seen. In the chart you see on the left, the peak during the global financial crisis was close to 1 million. In the first week, in mid-March, was 3 million, then 6 million, and then we kept counting in millions. Now, as I said, we are 40 millions. However, beyond the US, which are widely discussed in the international press and across the globe, the situation is not much better in other countries. So we have seen unemployment claims jumping up in other countries as well. We have data for Israel and Ireland, which shows that if we compare to the total workforce, the impact is similar as in the US, even higher, in fact. And in other countries where we didn't see unemployment insurance claims jump up, like many European countries, it's only because there has been a massive use of job retention schemes. So what we called Cassa Integrazione in Italy, Kurzarbeit in Germany, Chômage Partiel in France, or Belgium. And here you see data over the last 12 years, more or less, for Belgium, Germany, France, Italy, and Switzerland, and you see the massive increase in the share of employees that are currently on short-time work, so in Cassa Integrazione. Therefore, you can see that more than 40 or even up to 50% of workers in France are in short-time work. So you see that the picture is quite comparable with the United States, where 1 in 4 workers claim for an unemployment insurance. So the bottom line is that the shock, not surprisingly, given the nature of the shock, the extent of lockdowns that have been put in place, has been very bad, and labor markets have been suffering. However, the shock and the extent of the shock has not been the same for everyone. So sometimes past pandemics have been referred to, like wars, as being a great leveler. So a great leveler between everyone, rich and poor, young and old, and so on. Everyone was in the pandemic together. In fact, from what we can see at the moment, we can say, I think with a good degree of certainty, that we are not in this, some people are suffering more than others. The risk of infection is much higher for certain group, and usually the more vulnerable groups of the population than others, but also for the economic impact. First of all, here you see a chart from Italy, where we can see, in fact, is from for the region of Veneto, using administrative data, the so-called comunicazioni obbligatorie, that record every day the number of jobs that are open or closed, either because people are fired or because people quit or because people move on to another job. And you see that since the start of the lockdown in Veneto, and then of course even the rest of the lockdown in Italy, the number of jobs has been going down. This is the difference between 2020 and 2019. So it's negative. It means that there have been less job openings, net job openings, meaning hirings minus separations, than in 2019. It was more or less the same until the end of February. So more or less the economic situation and labor market in Veneto was doing as well as in or as bad as in 2019. And then all of a sudden, with a lot of the virus and the concern that we had at the beginning of March and mid-March, the labor market started to take a toll. And who is paying this? Is paying essentially on the entry side. As you know, Italy put in place a very bold package of labor market measures, among which Cassa Integrazione, so the short-time work scheme for every company in any sector. Before, Cassa Integrazione was mainly addressed to large industrial companies. And with this crisis, Cassa Integrazione in its various forms, Cassa Integrazione ordinaria, straordinaria, assegno ordinario, Cassa Integrazione in deroga, was extended to all companies, and economic dismissals were banned. So firings are not possible. Companies cannot fire people on the economic grounds. So not because they cannot fire someone because of COVID. They can fire someone if he's caught stealing in the company, but they cannot fire someone if there are economic issues related to COVID. Despite these super bold measures, so any company has access to Cassa Integrazione and workers cannot be fired, you can see that as of the early March, the number of jobs kept going down by around 6,000 jobs a week in Veneto. And this is at the levels, and I think even worse than the gloomiest weeks and months of the global financial crisis. And this was entirely driven by a fall in hiring. So the policies put in place, Cassa Integrazione and ban of dismissals, closed the exit door. So no one is exiting the labor market. You can see right beginning of April, and there are now more up-to-date data even for late April, and you see that the trend is keeping on the same in the same way. You can see that separations are less than in 2019 on the right of the chart. So you see that less people are quitting or being fired. This is not surprising because firings are now basically forbidden. However, the end labor market, so the hirings, are also going down, in fact, in a very significant way. So despite very generous Cassa Integrazione and the ban of dismissals, unemployment is going up, or at least the number of people without a job is going up because people are not entering the labor market. So temporary contracts are not being renewed, and people that were looking for a job could not find a new job, especially now at the beginning of the summer, the spring and the summer, and the seasonal jobs that are related to tourism. So you see that the most vulnerable workers, those that do not have a permanent job, and outside the labor market, they did not have a job, are paying this crisis in France, for instance, where similar policies have been put in place, but also in other countries. Temporary contracts are the first to be terminated when any crisis hits, even more a crisis of this size. And workers and people outside of the labor market, of course, find the doors shut and cannot therefore exit unemployment. And then, if we extend beyond temporary contracts, we see that this crisis has led bare a series of inequalities and cracks in our social protection systems that were already there before, but that have been widened by this crisis. Frontline workers in some hospitals, but especially in retail services, logistics, agriculture, kept working, and they had to keep working to help us eating and keeping on living, but they are often low paid and more exposed to the virus. Workers in non-standard jobs account for a large share of employment in the most affected sectors. Informal workers, this is a big issue in Italy, but it's an issue in other countries as well. Of course, are badly hit by the crisis, but because they cannot work and they most often do not have access to any social protection tool. Young workers are paying, usually paying crisis. Either in this case, it takes time to get back to the pre-global financial crisis levels of youth unemployment. And again, even today, young workers and even students that are finishing up studies and would like to find a job in the fall after the summer, of course, may risk paying the brunt of this crisis because they will find the door shut, as I said before, and they will be last in as the recovery kicks in. And then a specificity of this crisis is that while last time during the global financial crisis, women were relatively less hit by the shock because at least at the beginning, the global financial crisis had an impact on construction and manufacturing, which are more men-dominated sectors. These times, women are both at the forefront of many of these essential services. Women are, most nurses are women, and in the hospital, overall, not among doctors, but overall, there are many and majority of women. There are many women in retail services and other essential services, so they were both on the front line of the essential services, but they also compose a large share of employment in services that were shut down. So retail services beyond supermarkets that were shut down, shops, employ a lot of women, and they were left at home, plus with all the caring duties for children mainly, and maybe older parents, that unfortunately still fall in many countries mainly on women. So they have double or triple burden from this crisis, and they are therefore likely to be more impacted than in the past and more impacted than men. And this is a different feature, let's say, with respect to previous crises. OECD countries and Italy as well have taken bold and unprecedented measures to this unprecedented crisis. All countries, they have tracker at the OECD, a general tracker, but also a labor market and social policy tracker. And we see that all countries have taken measures to provide support, financial support to firms. In Italy, for instance, the Decreto Liquidità. But many countries, almost all countries, also extended and made more generous the income support to people losing jobs and income. In Italy, just take the 600 euros that were given to self-employed workers is a cash transfer that did not exist before and was introduced to fill a gap that was there since ever, where self-employed had no proper access to the social protection system. Then almost 90% of OECD countries extended or introduced short-time work schemes, so like Cassa Integrazione in Italy, but the job retention scheme in the United Kingdom is also an interesting example of a entirely new scheme that was introduced from scratch in few weeks the British government. Many countries, of course, took measures to reduce workers' exposures to COVID-19, like encouraging teleworking, making the rules for telework more flexible, or introducing higher and stronger standards for occupational health. And then many countries had to do something for parents that were left at home with children without childcare or school, as the schools and the childcare facilities were closed. And so various forms of childcare support were introduced, from extraordinary paid leave or vouchers and income support, like the bonus babysitter in Italy. And then sick pay was introduced. Few countries, most notably the United States and Korea, did not have a proper mandatory sick pay in place, and they introduced, at least in part, measures to help people stay in their dwellings have been introduced in many OECD countries, because, of course, if we ask people to shelter at home, not everyone had a home where to shelter, or without income from work, some people were at risk of being evicted or finding themselves in serious trouble. So some measures have been introduced in 2/3 of OECD countries. Finally, some measures have been introduced to this spatial crisis, where some workers have been quarantined because they were coming from let's say, dangerous countries. At some point, Italy was a dangerous country, or because a member of the household was affected by COVID-19, and therefore also other people that were not infected had to quarantine. Finally, few countries, a fourth, made some changes to dismissal regulation. I mentioned the case of Italy, where economic dismissals have been banned. Spain did the same. France introduced some reinforced checking on economic dismissals. Other countries made sure that individual dismissals, so for individual fault, were subject to increased scrutiny to avoid that people that are maybe sick or at home caring for family members are not fired using these schemes. So very bold measures, many billions. It's still complicated to quantify the billions that the governments, just on the fiscal side, forgetting the monetary side, have been put into these policies, and yet things will not turn out, let's say, well in the next couple of weeks and months. At the OECD, we are working on two scenarios, and I saw that the Bank of Italy yesterday also released first forecast that will be released later in a few days. But the governor mentioned them in his concluding remarks. And there are two scenarios. The first one is a scenario where the lockdowns taken enforced during the recent months and worked, where the so-called TTT, test, track, and trace, works. So we are able to test people, to track where they are, and to treat them if need be. And this leads to no second wave. We have developed, and we're still working, some colleagues at OECD, an epidemiological model to help countries understanding which policy mix is useful to put in place to avoid a second wave. And we are hopeful that a mix of TTT with enhanced personal hygiene measures and still some restrictions on large meetings and gatherings could avoid a second wave, while ensuring the ability to start again with economic activity. However, we cannot discard the second scenario, where there will be a second wave in the fall or in the winter, and we have to, and OECD governments would have to reintroduce some lockdown measures. So these two scenarios lead us to pretty dire economic forecast. The OECD will release them on June 10, so I cannot yet tell you, and the colleagues in the economics department are still working on the numbers. I cannot give you a precise numbers, but I can tell you that the increase in unemployment will be around 3 times higher than the increase that was registered during the global financial crisis. So you can see that the impact will be massive. And we see it already in the data on business and consumer confidence. Here you see on the left business confidence in future tendency of employment going down, massively down, and the consumer confidence in future tendency of unemployment going massively up for all groups and all sectors. You see going down in manufacturing, construction, retail, trade, for young people, older workers, lower income households, higher income households, low educated people, high educated people. Everyone is seeing significant worsening of the employment prospects in the future. So the situation is going to be complicated. This is the first assessment. We are working on a chapter for the employment outlook that will be released in early July. You will find detailed, let's say, assessment with the available data of the impact of the first few months of the crisis, a fairly detailed description of the policies put in place by OECD governments in the recent months, and then a tentative discussion of the way ahead, how we should move in the coming months. We put in place unprecedented measures, which also have unprecedented costs for public budgets. How should we go for after that? How should can we ensure a safe exit from these measures while not falling into a rush of rolling back the measures and having a massive surge of unemployment or a layoff. So these are big challenges. We are just at the beginning of understanding what happened. So it's complicated already to understand what happened. It's even more complicated to understand what should be done in the coming months. But we are trying to do our best to understand first and to support OECD governments across the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting to know first the causes and what happened and the consequences of what happened with the COVID-19 outbreak, and also what might be the implications for certain socio-economic classes, but also demographic. We have seen also some demographic data. That was very interesting. For the first question that I have is that in your brief you discussed about short-term work schemes. We have seen Italy. We touched on the UK, Germany. But why do you think these labor schemes have not been implemented in the US and Canada?
In fact, the US and Canada as well have a form of short-time work scheme. In the US, it exists since many decades. It's run at state level. However, it's not very much used. In fact, it's not used at all. It's really 0% of workforce that is used. And historically, the US used much more unemployment insurance than short-time work. And I think it's interesting to see this is due partly to some to the design of these instruments, which is a bit more cumbersome, and to the knowledge of how this works across companies. And there are proposals to make them easier to use and more, let's say, more understandable for companies. However, it's interesting to note that even among economists, there is a significant divide across the two sides of the Atlantic, because you can see even progressive economists in the US, like Paul Krugman or Jason Furman, who was the previous chief of economic advisor to President Obama, who recently said that they don't think short-term work is a useful scheme in the US because It's less efficient than unemployment insurance because people get stuck in their job and cannot move to another job if there is the opportunity, and therefore they think that unemployment insurance is more effective. I think this attitude may at some point certainly and has some validity. Short-time work are no silver bullet and are no panacea for all the problems that we face. However, for a temporary crisis, which in the case of some sectors at least could be in this case, they are very useful to retain the human capital and avoiding the social, let's say, the non-economic cost of dismissals, because one has never to forget that being dismissed is no fun beyond the economic side. Even if you get €1 of cassa integrazione, €1 of unemployment benefit is the same, it's still €1. Nevertheless, the non-economic side of dismissals is different. So the feeling of being dismissed, the social stigma of being dismissed is different. So I think short-term work schemes are important and can play a major role, but they are only a temporary fix and they cannot last forever. So the big challenge now for Italy and as well for other countries is how to think the exit and the roll back of some of these measures. But yes, there are differences across the two sides of the Atlantic. These are historic differences and they reflect part institutional features, but also different point of view.
Thank you very much. Another point that you touched in your brief was how different how government are addressing the policy tension between workers who are invited to go back to work and children who are staying at home. Do you have any predictions or do you have any facts about how this tension might be balanced in policy-wise?
Let's say that's indeed a big issue because we see, especially in Italy, but not only, that schools are still closed, and while people are requested to go back to work in some cases, or in any case, we hope that by September they will be requested to go back to work and more or less go back to normal, and therefore we need to find ways to address this as given the specificity of this crisis, we cannot rely on grandparents to take care of children. So countries have put in place a number of measures, but they are, again, temporary fixes. And one should not think that the solution is telework. So the solution for school closures and the closure of childcare facilities is not to ask people, and let me say women, to work from home. First of all, because one cannot work from home if children are around, because they rightly so make some noise and try to have some fun and not get bored. And second, because it risks making telework a ghetto for people that cannot afford alternative childcare facilities, or for people, again, mostly unfortunately women that may have to stay at home and they may forego career opportunities and any other opportunities that happen in the office because they have to stay at home. So I think opening schools is, let's say, there are some health issues that have to be dealt by epidemiologists and the experts in the field. However, from an economic point of view, reopening schools is a top priority for parents, but also, I quickly mentioned that, but should deserve an entire session, I would say, for students. We should not forget that beyond the many voluntary teachers that have tried to catch up on Zoom and any other software to keep on working remotely via video and so on and so forth, there are many children that have been left behind, either because schools have not the ability to do digital classes, or because these children, the families did not have access to internet or proper computers or a computer for everyone. Because if you have more than one child, it's not enough to have one computer. You need to have two and three, and so even in relatively well-off or at least not poor families, this could become easily complicated, and people and children need to be followed, so you cannot just leave them in front of the computer forever. So the long-term cost of this crisis, even of these few months that have been lost, could be extremely high. So this is a top priority, again, not only for workers but for these children, and we have to pay very careful attention, because the risk of divides between those who had access to a computer and teaching, and those who did not, those who had parents that could do some alternative classes at home, and those who did not, could become definitely unbearable in the next years and even decades.
Thank you very much. You also touched on what was going to be my second question, my third question about digital tools and how crucial they are in the virus. I think you explained it perfectly what the problem is. The following question, and now talking about the UK, how do you think the COVID-19 crisis is going to affect Brexit and its economic consequences? In particular, I would like to know whether this will affect the immigration scheme based on worker skills that the UK wanted to put in place.
Certainly, let's say COVID-19 is requiring everyone to rethink more or less everything, of course, including a big shocking event like Brexit and all the changes that are required. Certainly, we have seen that many essential services rely on low-paid workers, in many cases migrant workers. All of a sudden, instead of pushing away migrants, many countries, the UK, but also Italy and others, had to find a way of retaining or bringing migrants from other countries, from Eastern European countries, or also from non-European countries, because no one was collecting foods in the fields, and some essential services were not ensured. So I'm sure that some rethinking is needed. I do not know what the countries will be available to do, but certainly I think this crisis may, I cannot say more than may, lead us, everyone, to rethink the role of low-paid workers, including migrants, in many of our essential services. We have seen them when we were locked at home and we could only go to the supermarket and buy essential food and other things that we needed. And we realized how important they are, and they could be in our lives. So I think a general thinking could be needed. I'm not sure what will happen in practice.
Thank you very much. These were the questions from me. Now we are very happy to read questions from our audience. So please feel free to leave your questions below. And until we receive some questions, we have received some during the week. The first one comes from Luigi Dante Gaviano, who's a student here in Oxford. He says, the media are mainly discussing the recently implemented recovery fund. I guess he's talking about the EU. Yet less attention has been paid on the SURE program. What do you think those 125 billion euros will be used for? Will be only used for short-term works or not? And the second question is, do you think that the 120 billion euros loans to member states are enough to boost public expenditure?
So SURE indeed is a quite an interesting program, because before the recovery fund, it was an agreement for the EU to go on financial markets and collect funds, money, on top of existing EU budget, which is fairly tiny, as you may know. It's 1% of GDP, so certainly not enough to and already allocated, so not enough to face a sudden and massive crisis like the one we saw. So SURE was an interesting proposal that in fact comes from quite some discussions in the past, when after the global financial crisis, a few academics and countries started to discuss how to strengthen the fiscal capacity of the European Union to face shocks, and in particular asymmetric shocks, because the monetary policies in the euro area can provide answers to shocks that are more or less symmetric in nature, because the monetary policy is one in Frankfurt for all euro area countries. On the opposite, fiscal policies are done at national level, but some countries may not have the leeway to do all what they should to face a sudden shock. And so there was a discussion launched at the political level by former Commissioner for Employment, Laszlo Andor, then picked up by the Italian presidency of the EU, in particular by Minister Padoan, and then by other countries and many academics and think tanks behind, Google, SEPs, just to name a few, but then many national ones as well, on how to devise a system that could afford some transfers linked to, and that case was to unemployment. And so was an unemployment benefit scheme at the EU level, let's say, still based on transfers, not the EU paying direct unemployment benefit to a worker, but transfers. So this was in the missions letter that President von der Leyen gave to Commissioners Gentiloni and Schmidt for employment. So they had this in the missions letter. This was for later in the mandate. But when they were faced with the crisis, both Commissioners Gentiloni and Schmidt took this out of their to-do list, let's say, and transformed it into a tool to support short-time work across European countries. So these billions that, if I'm not wrong, are 100 billions, and 100 billions to be collected in the market, so to be seen, will be used to provide loans, so cheaper loans, especially in the case of Italy, for paying short-time work. So basically, short-time work, paying for short-time work is the conditionality attached to this loan. So you get this loan at a very favorable rate if you spend them on short-time work. So this will be certainly very useful. It will not be enough because it's very small. Italy has already spent, I don't remember how many billions, but more than the allocated, let's say, more than the billions that it could get through SURE from the EU in paying Cassa Integrazione and similar tools. So this will not be enough. But I think it was very important to shift the public debate in Europe for the first time, allowing the European Commission, the European Union to go in the markets, raise funds, increase its fiscal capacity, and this recovery fund comes on top of that because it's, let's say, a sort of SURE on steroids and more and larger than simple short-term work. So I think it was definitely a good step. It's an interesting tool. It remains a small one, but let's say any contribution at the moment is useful, especially, and on this then I'll stop, on to give the sign that the European Union is taking the challenge seriously. As Mario Draghi has shown us, and as any economic students know, expectations are what matters most. More than what you do is what people and markets believe that you will do that matters. So if you show that you're committed and you will do the famous whatever it takes to save the European Union, Italy, the euro, whatever, is not even necessary maybe to spend this money because markets will know and they will not bet on the default. So in some cases, it's really enough to show commitment. And I think over the last few months, despite all the complexities and natural complexities that are inherent to this kind of discussions, European countries and the European Union has made major significant steps forwards. Maybe not enough, but major step forward in showing commitment to the stability of the euro and keeping all countries together.
Thank you very much. We have just received a question from Andrea Ramazzotti, who's a PhD student at the LSE. He asks, what do you think the impact of COVID-19 will be on university enrollment? Will students decide to postpone enrollment until teaching goes back to normal, or will they prefer to continue studying until employment opportunities recover?
Let's say that I'm not envious of people that have to make these decisions because there is no good option. Let's say On the one hand, let's say there are not many options in the labor market, so it's not easy to say I'll postpone enrollment, and in the meantime I'll take up a small job to do something in between, because there will not be many job opportunities, certainly not many good job opportunities in the coming months, and after even after the pandemic is gone, because as I said, unfortunately, young people are the first out and last in when a crisis hits and the recovery then starts. So usually in a normal crisis, let's say in the previous crisis, was certainly a good idea to use this time and invest in education and university. This time things are a bit different, because even university activities have been disrupted, but certainly it remains a good opportunity to use this time to invest in education, in other forms of education. Of course, the challenge for universities is to keep the quality of the offer at a very high level, despite the lack of physical interaction. And I think this, for university as for many companies, is let's say a watershed moment, where things that we have been discussing for years now all of a sudden become necessary and fundamental for the survival of universities themselves. Because, like in the UK, universities are businesses. So anyway, they have to rely on people paying substantial amounts of money to come and to the university and take their services. So they cannot just rely on public money. They are asking public money in the UK, I've seen, but to be seen what and if they will get. But therefore, the challenge for the entire university community is to offer similar and or same level of quality of education. And I think that's important for their survival, but also for this generation of people that would be damaged if they left education in the hope of getting something better. They may get a small job outside, but maybe with no long future. So let's say I cannot say what will happen. I can only say my hope, and my hope is that universities take up the challenge in responding to this crisis, and that and students can afford studying and afford having good quality teachings, in order to then go in the labor market when things will be a bit better.
Thank you very much. We also received another question by Cecilia Corsini, who's also a PhD student here in Oxford. She asks, what do you think of the current Italian pension scheme, Quota 100? For those who are not familiar, it's a scheme that says that if you are 62 years old and you have 38 years of pension contributions, you are allowed to go to have a pension. Dr. Garnero, what is your opinion on that?
So this was a pre-retirement scheme, basically, to call it as it should be called, and that was put in place in 2019 by the coalition at the time between Five Stars and the League, to allow earlier retirement. And this was after years of complaints about the reforms that was undertaken during the global financial crisis in 2011 and 12 by the government of Mario Monti and the minister Fornero. So the issue at the time was that for a long time, Italy has postponed full application, let's say, of the switch to the pension system based on contributions that started in 95, but only for new entrants, and therefore the cost for a public budget of pensions continued to rise as population kept luckily aging. But of course, during the financial crisis, this situation was untenable, and the government proposed, but a very large majority in the parliament approved a reform that was indeed tough. Everyone, let's say, at least among the Italian people here, will remember Minister Fornero moved and crying at the presentation of this reform, because she was well aware about what she was asking to Italian people. What happened before is what happened after is that most parties that voted for that reform then started disavowing that reform and calling for more flexibility of whatever form. That reform, if you want, had the issue of being too strict and too sudden, without enough flexibilities for, especially for workers that do difficult jobs and may need to retire before. So the solution already under Renzi was to introduce some flexibility with the so-called Ape Social, and then other forms for women, Opzione Donna, and so on. But then, especially the Northern League, the League by Matteo Salvini, asked for more ambitious changes that took the form of Quota 100. So to answer now, to come to the answer to the question, I think that while on the one hand there could be some reason to think that some people had to afford, had to be able to retire a bit before than what the Fornero reform had for them. These measures was a fairly costly, very costly measure, paid entirely out of new deficit and therefore debt for future generations, with no effect for the labor market, and contrary to what was claimed, because the one way which in which this reform was presented was that it would help young workers get into the labor market, but this is not the way it works. And secondly, it did not even help workers most in need. We see from the data that given the rules that were put in place, basically only men working in the north of Italy with stable and continuous careers had access to Quota, whereas more vulnerable workers, women, and people with discontinuous careers in other parts of the countries did not have access to it. So all in all, I think it was a measure that had some grounds and some reasons, but was ill-designed and badly targeted, and therefore was certainly not what was needed for the Italian labor market, and even for pensioners and soon-to-be pensioners.
Thank you very much. These are our questions from our audience, and we normally end our interviews by asking a fun fact from our guests. And the question normally is, during your career at the OECD, but also as an advisor to Prime Minister Letta, do you remember any particular fun fact, something funny that happened during your career?
But certainly, let's say that when I was in Palazzo Chigi, so it was a short period, only 10 months, but it was a very exciting moment, fast, steep learning curve of many things of how the Italian administration works and how politics works as well, and so on and so forth. But certainly the most unforgettable moment was the G20 in St. Petersburg, so organized by Russia. I was the assistant Sherpa, or as it is called among the people working in G20 is the yak. The yak is the animal that help the Sherpas in Himalaya carrying the luggages and so on. So you get the prime minister, the leader, then you get the Sherpa, and then you get the yak, and there was the yak, and it was, first of all, extremely interesting to see the interactions among countries and leaders, and at the Leader Summit, the random meetings between world leaders, Obama, Putin, Hollande, Cameron, Merkel, Letta, Erdogan, and so on, in times, and there were times of, let's say, the G20 is usually focused on economic issues, but that time was in 2013, the focus was on the war in Syria, so it was not so fun, of course, but it was a moment I remember quite fondly as a let's say direct experience of countries and leaders trying for a few days, a couple of days, to close themselves somewhere and try to talk and solve some world problems. So this is certainly something I will never forget in my life. All these VIPs and famous leaders across the world and the people that go around them, but also as a moment where there is the hope, at least, to come to some agreed solutions. That was not really the case, let's be honest, in 2013, as in many other summits, but at least there were really many people that tried seriously to come to solutions for world problems. In that case was the recovery of the crisis and the war in Syria. We are still dealing with similar issues today. I still believe in international cooperation. I think that despite all the issues and all the problems that are in with international organizations and international fora like G20 and G8, we need to find places for countries and leaders to talk and understand each other, understand the different points of view, and maybe find some common solutions.
Thank you very much. This is the end of our interview. I would like to say thank you very much to Andrea Garnero for his presentation and for answering our questions this morning. I hope that soon we will be able to invite you to Oxford and have a talk in person.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and great job that you do even during the pandemic.
Thank you very much. I hope that we will see you soon in person. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Bye. Ciao, ciao.
Bye bye. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We had a very interesting talk by Andrea Garnero. And before ending this live, I would like to say thank you to Emma Baldassarri and Fabio Spagliardi, our secretary and IT officer, Luigi Dante Gaviano, our special economics editor, also Giorgia Ramazzotti, Cecilia Corsini, and James Magia, our press officers, and our sponsors for allowing us to continue our activities, in particular Banca Intesa and Bibuona. Finally, I would like to say thank you for joining us, and I hope that you enjoyed our talk. And if you did, please leave a like on our Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, and I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.